I was unprepared for what transpired when a knock on the bathroom door one peaceful Sunday afternoon turned everything upside down. It was one of those ordinary Sundays that lulls you into a delusion of peace. Sundays had always been my day to relax, take a break from the week, and just lose myself in my thoughts or a video game. But this Sunday was different, even though I wasn't aware of it at first. After lunch, I went to the bathroom with the intention of staying there for a while. The sun was high in the sky, casting gentle rays through the curtains of our small suburban home, creating a warmth that made everything feel a little too. I enjoyed browsing through my phone, maybe playing a game or two, and simply enjoying the solitude that comes with wanting a peaceful minute to yourself. My haven, where I could block out the outside world and take a deep breath, had always been the restroom. As I sat there looking through my phone, I had no idea that what had been intended to be a typical quiet day was going to take a change. I could hear footsteps faintly echoing down the corridor, the buzz of the refrigerator, the distant sound of the TV in the living room, and the creak of the floorboards were all commonplace sounds in our home. So at first I didn't really pay much attention. However, there was something different about these footsteps, something intentional. They stopped just outside the bathroom door, softly but deliberately, and then there was a knock. There was nothing that said, "Come out now," or an urgent knock. However, my mother's voice, which sounded a little too happy, followed, which was odd enough to cause me to halt. "Are you in there, my love?" I looked at the closed door and scowled. "I will be leaving in a minute." "Okay, Mom?" Her voice remained bright, a bit too loud. As she answered, "Go slowly." I tried to ignore the strange exchange as I returned to my phone after hearing her footsteps recede down the corridor. Mom never stopped by the restroom to see how I was doing. We weren't a family that required regular reports on our whereabouts and activities. But today she felt compelled to drop by and say hello through the door. It was strange, but I didn't think it was worth it. Minutes went by, and the silence returned. My mom wasn't behaving like herself. She hadn't done anything inappropriate, but the tone of her voice had struck me as strange. The house was still quiet, save for the odd sound of the wind rustling the windows. I tried to unwind, but something about that knock kept coming back to me. I tried to shake off the nagging feeling of unease by shaking my head. Perhaps she was simply feeling good, or perhaps she wanted to talk about something later, or perhaps she was just checking in. But no matter how many reasons I came up with, I couldn't completely ignore how strange it was. Then, just as I was beginning to calm down again, I heard her footsteps return. They were slower and more hesitant this time, and for some reason, my heart rate increased. She was standing outside the door once more. But why was everything in there okay? This time, her voice was lower, almost hesitant. "Yeah," I said, my voice breaking just a little. "I'll be leaving shortly," she said. "All right," but she didn't. After a pause, a beat of stillness that went on for a bit too long. "Make a move." My heart began to race in my chest when I heard her standing there, right outside the door. There was no doubting the tension rising in the air, but I had no understanding of why I felt so tense. I got up and glanced in the mirror. I looked exactly the same, with my sweatshirt, my unkempt hair, and everything else. But the atmosphere in the room was different. There was something heavy and eerie hanging in the air. I heard her footsteps recede down the corridor once again after what seemed like an eternity. My body relaxed a little when I released a breath I hadn't even realized I'd been holding. But the uneasiness persisted, with a towel wrapped around my waist. I opened the bathroom door and entered the hallway. I finished in the bathroom, splashing water on my face as though it would relieve the weird tension that had descended upon me. The water felt cool against my skin, but it didn't do much to clear my head. I couldn't get rid of the sense that something was strange, as if the air in the home had changed just a little bit. Even though everything appeared to be normal, the same old photos on the walls, the same gentle lighting coming in through the windows. The door of my mom's room was closed as usual as I strolled down the hallway in my bare feet, which padded lightly against the wooden floor. I continued on to my own room at the end of the hall, but as I reached for the doorknob, I stopped because I noticed something. My mom never entered my room without asking. So the door was slightly open, just a crack. But enough to make my heart skip a beat. Never. I carefully pulled the door open, half expecting to see her standing there. But there was no one in the room. Everything was in its proper place. My desk was a jumble of papers and other miscellaneous items. My bed was made, and my clothing was heaped on the chair in the corner. But there was something else I couldn't quite place. My mom's perfume, which had a subtle aroma that permeated the air. Although it was faint and hardly perceptible, it was sufficient to validate my presumption that she had entered the room. But why? What had she been doing? Anyway, my thoughts were racing as I perched on the side of my bed. I lay back on the bed and stared up at the ceiling, trying to make sense of everything. The more I thought about it, the more questions I had. Perhaps she had just come in to clean up. Or maybe she needed something from my room. But that didn't make sense. She never did that. And the fact that she hadn't mentioned it when she knocked on the bathroom door earlier only made it more confusing. Why hadn't she said anything when she entered my room? There was more to the tale than why she had stayed outside the restroom like that and why I felt like she was keeping something from me. As the afternoon went on, I kept going over the events again in my mind in an attempt to understand the strange tension that had developed between us. Something was happening that I couldn't quite identify, and even though I wanted to dismiss it as nothing, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that things were going to change significantly in the days that followed that odd bathroom encounter. I couldn't exactly understand the difference in the atmosphere between my mom and me. It wasn't like we had a major argument or a falling out, but there appeared to have been an invisible boundary crossed that none of us was aware of. The tension between us is subtle but unmistakable. And it started with little things like the way she would watch me a little too closely when I walked into the room and then quickly look away, pretending to be busy with something else. Or the way she seemed to be around more, always finding a reason to be in the same room as me. I wasn't sure how to bring it up, or even if I should try. It felt like every time I tried to carve out some time for myself, she'd show up sitting in the living room when I was there, cooking in the kitchen when I was grabbing a snack, or even folding laundry on the couch when I was playing video games. At first I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to coincidence. Maybe she just wanted to spend more time together. Or maybe she had something on her mind and didn't know how to talk about it. But the more it happened, the more it became clear that it wasn't just random. There was an underlying reason, something neither of us was willing to confront. One evening we were sitting on the couch watching TV. The soft glow of the screen flickered in the dark living room, and the only sounds were the low hum of the show and the occasional clinking of the ice in her glass. I was trying to focus on the show, but my mind kept drifting back to the way she was sitting next to me, closer than usual, so close that I could feel the heat radiating from her body. My heart began to beat faster, and I couldn't figure out why she didn't say much, just the occasional comment about the show. But every word she spoke seemed heavier, like there was something behind it. My skin tingled every time her arm touched mine. And as the credits rolled and the show came to an end, I wondered why I was suddenly so hyper-aware of every little movement she made. I kept my eyes on the screen, but all I could think about was the space, or rather, the lack of space between us. A wave of relief passed over me. I was prepared to stand up and put some distance between us. Perhaps because of the tension from sitting so close for so long. She spoke before I could grab the remote control to switch off the TV. She replied in a calm, almost reflective voice, "You've really grown up." I paused, the remote still in my hand, not knowing how to react. "Yeah, I guess," I muttered, looking out of the corner of my eye, and she was staring at me in a way that made my stomach turn. As if she was seeing me for the first time, not just as her son, but as someone else, someone older. There was a long silence that made my palms sweat, and I wasn't sure what to say. She did something unexpected before I could come up with a response. Even though it was a soft touch, I felt as though I had been struck by a lightning bolt. My initial reaction was to pull away, but I chose not to. My breath stuck in my throat. I was unable to. "I'm proud of you," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the quiet room, and I just sat there frozen. my heart racing as her fingers curled slightly around mine. Her hand lingered for a moment longer before she slowly pulled it away, leaving a cold, empty feeling where her warmth had been. I finally exhaled, though my mind was racing, and I thanked him, though the words felt hollow. I managed to say it before turning back to the TV. But I wasn't really seeing it anymore because my mind was racing and I was trying to figure out what had happened. I could feel her watching me, her eyes following every inch of my face. But I couldn't bring myself to look at her again. It was almost as if nothing had occurred, as if we hadn't just crossed a line that none of us knew how to cross. She remarked, "I'm going to bed," as she rose up suddenly, shattering the quiet that had fallen over us like a thick blanket. "Good night." As soon as I heard her footsteps recede down the corridor, I responded, still attempting to digest everything while still gazing at the computer. My thoughts were a tangled mix of perplexity, wonder, and something more I didn't want to confess to myself. Why had I simply sat there? I released a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Why did it feel like this was only the beginning? And why hadn't I withdrawn my hand? The days that followed were, to put it mildly, uncomfortable. I tried my hardest to avoid her, making excuses to stay in my room or leave the house whenever I could. But the tension that hung between us like a dark cloud was unavoidable. I kept thinking about that moment on the couch, the way her hand felt on mine, and how intimate her voice sounded. And then one evening things got out of hand. When she came to my door, I was attempting to do some schoolwork because it was late. My heart pounded as I said, "Come in." She entered the room with a little uncertain expression, which was out of character for her. "Hey," she began quietly, lingering in the doorway as though she wasn't sure whether to enter completely. "Can you assist me with, in the garage, something?" Felt risky to be alone with her, but I couldn't precisely say no. So I pondered for a second. "Yes," I said, getting up and following her down the hallway. The garage was dark and cold, with only one overhead light. She led me to a pile of boxes and talked about how she needed to organize them. But her words sounded far away because I was too preoccupied with how the air between us seemed to crackle with tension as we moved the boxes side by side. I could feel the distance between us getting smaller even though we hadn't physically moved closer. It was like there was an unexpressed pull pulling us together, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, it was getting harder to ignore. I caught a glimpse of her out of the corner of my eye, and our gazes briefly met, and something changed in her eyes, something raw and vulnerable, and it made my stomach turn upside down. She suddenly took a step closer, and as her hand touched mine, my whole body jumped. I froze, not knowing what to do, my thoughts urging me to take a step back and say anything to put an end to this. But I remained still. After a long period of oppressive quiet, she added, "I've been thinking about you a lot." My heart pounded in my chest, and I didn't know how to respond. In a voice that was almost audible above a whisper, the words became stuck in my throat as I opened my lips to say something. Anything. I was having trouble breathing. I was unable to think. And then she leaned in before I realized what was happening. The distance between us vanished in an instant, and I could feel her warm, gentle breath on my skin. Her lips lingered inches from mine, and everything else vanished in that instant. Even though I knew it was wrong, there was nothing I could do to stop it from happening. Her face was so close to mine. Her breath was warm against my skin. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure what was real anymore. The next few moments seemed to be a blur, as though time itself had slowed down, trapping me in this real space where everything was happening too quickly but not fast enough. I knew that something irrevocable was going to happen, and there was no stopping it. But my thoughts were a jumbled tangle of emotions that I couldn't even begin to sift through. Her eyes met mine in search of a sign, a permission that I wasn't sure I was ready to provide. But before I could give it any thought, her lips pushed softly against mine, hesitantly but unquestionably. My entire body clenched as the moment's truth hit me. But I didn't back down since it wasn't like anything I had ever experienced before. I was unable to do so because of an unsaid magnetic force that held me still. When she pulled away, Her eyes were wide and filled with an emotion I couldn't quite place. Fear, confusion, maybe even regret. But before I could say anything or even process what had just happened, she kissed me again. It was only for a moment, but in that moment, everything around us seemed to change. The garage, the boxes, the cold air. None of it mattered anymore. All that was left was the gentle yet overwhelming sensation of her lips against mine. This time, there was no hesitation. It was deeper, more intense, and all of a sudden, I felt more real and dangerous. My heart was racing and pounding so loudly in my ears that I was sure she could hear it too. But I still didn't pull away. Instead, I found myself leaning into the kiss, trying to make sense of what was happening. And now there was no turning back. The intensity of the moment grew, our breaths quickening as the seconds passed. There was a strange kind of desperation in the way she held on to me, as if she was afraid to let go, as if she needed this as much as I did. However, there was no time to consider that, no time to question the feelings that were rushing through me. All I could do was feel caught in the storm of emotions that had suddenly taken over. And then, without warning, we staggered backward out of the garage and into the house. The quiet between us was not more loud than any words could have been. It seemed as though we both knew what was about to happen, but neither of us was brave enough to speak it aloud. We ended ourselves in the living room, where it all began. The TV's dim light created lengthy shadows that made everything seem even more bizarre. As she approached, her eyes never left mine, and my heart accelerated. There was a moment of hesitation, a flicker of doubt in her eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. Her hand found mine again, fingers intertwining in a way that felt both familiar and strange. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and palpable, as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for what was about to happen. Her body was against mine, and we were entangled in each other and lost in the moment as she leaned in once again, her lips meeting mine with a feeling of urgency that had not before been. It was different now, more intense, more certain, and time seemed to blur. After that, I couldn't tell how long we stood there wrapped up in each other, lost in a moment that felt both impossible and inevitable. There was no thinking, no rationalizing, just pure emotion. Every breath and movement felt like a step further into uncharted territory, but neither of us stopped. Eventually, we found ourselves on the couch, the soft fabric beneath us a stark contrast to the intensity of the moment. Everything was moving so fast, but it felt too slow, as if time had warped around us. Her lips never left mine, and I could feel the weight of everything we weren't saying pressing down on us. Even though this was occurring and we could no longer ignore it, there was still a part of me that was unable to really understand it when it all came to pass. How had we arrived? I knew this was terrible, but how had things gotten so out of hand? We had crossed a line that neither of us could uncross. But in the heat of the moment, it didn't feel like a mistake. Rather, it felt like something we had been tiptoeing around for days, maybe even weeks. And now that it was happening, there was no stopping it. I knew that, but in the heat of the moment, her touch made my skin tingle, and every kiss and touch sent a shock of electricity through me. I'm not sure how long we were engrossed in one another. Time didn't seem to matter. When I finally pulled away, gasping for air, my mind was racing with 1,000 thoughts all at once. But none of them were enough to overcome the pull I still felt toward her. She looked at me, her eyes full of a mixture of emotions that I couldn't even begin to sort out. For a moment, we just stared at each other, trying to catch our breath and try to make sense of what had just happened. But before I could say anything, before I could even come up with the right words, she kissed me again. This kiss was different from the others. It was slower, softer, and contained more than just physical attraction. It felt as though she was trying to communicate with me in a way that neither of us could express verbally. And I felt it too. Her hands moved to my waist, drawing me in closer as the kiss intensified, the air around us heavy with the weight of the moment as we moved in a quiet rhythm. The outside world forgotten as we let ourselves get lost in each other. It wasn't rushed. but it was full of tenderness that made my heart race. A connection that felt both familiar and new. The warmth of her body against mine was reassuring and grounding. And for the first time in a long time, I felt totally present and ensnared. We sat side by side, the silence between us heavy with the weight of everything we weren't saying. As the night wore on, the intensity of the moment began to fade, replaced by a quiet, almost peaceful stillness. After that, we didn't speak. There were no words that could describe what had just happened, no way to explain the emotions swirling around us like a storm. Even as the silence descended upon us, I realized that nothing would ever be the same again because we had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, entered a territory neither of us had been ready for. And even though the night may have ended in silence, the unspoken truth hung heavy between us. I could feel her head resting against my shoulder, her breathing slow and steady, and for the first time in hours, my mind started to quiet. This was by no means the end of it. When we were sitting together in the dim light of the living room, it didn't seem to matter that there would be consequences. There always are. The remainder of the night was a haze of silent moments, a tornado of feelings, and all that we couldn't control. It didn't matter since something had changed, and there was no turning back. We didn't discuss what had happened, but it was obvious that everything had happened, and we had allowed it to happen. There was no way to make sense of it, no way to explain the rush of emotions or the choices we made. We just sat in silence, allowing the darkness to descend on us. We were both fully aware that tomorrow would present new difficulties and questions that we weren't prepared to handle. But for the time being, in the stillness of the night, the only thing that mattered was that we were the ones who would wake up too soon. The peaceful living room where I had spent the night was illuminated by gentle light coming through the curtains when I woke up. The stark contrast between the flurry of emotions from the previous night and the calm of the room made it even more clear that my mom was no longer there. She must have departed at some time, but the weight of her presence hung over me like a shadow. I sat up slowly as the events of the night before came flooding back like an overpowering, inevitable tidal wave. Everything had changed between us, and there was no turning back. I poured myself a glass of water, but the cool liquid did nothing to calm the storm inside of me. My mind was racing, a mess of tangled thoughts that I couldn't seem to untangle. What we had done, what was going to happen now, the questions were endless, and I didn't have a single answer. I couldn't pretend it didn't happen. I couldn't act like life was going to just go back to the way it was before. The silence in the house was almost suffocating. I stood up and wandered to the kitchen, half expecting to find her there, making breakfast, maybe waiting for me, but the room was empty, and the house felt empty. And for a brief moment I wasn't sure whether that was a relief or another layer of tension to add to the pile. Shortly after, I heard her footsteps in the hallway. They were quiet but distinct, and as I turned to see her standing there with her face momentarily inscrutable, my heart skipped a beat. "Good morning," she eventually replied in a hushed, almost hesitant voice, but neither of us answered, the tension between us heavy with the weight of unsaid words. I wanted to speak more to find out what was going through her mind, but the words wouldn't come. "In the morning," I responded, my mouth dry, the word coming out more strained than I intended. We remained there for what seemed like an eternity, neither of us understanding how to deal with the fallout from what had transpired, since everything seemed too fresh and vulnerable. Every second that passed was heavier than the one before, and it seemed as though we were both trapped in a moment from which we had no idea how to escape. Eventually, she broke the stillness. She replied, "I've been thinking about last night," her eyes revealing her doubt about what had transpired. I swallowed hard, my chest constricting. I had been dreading this talk, but it was unavoidable. We couldn't ignore it or act as though nothing had changed. "Yes," I was able to say. "Me too," in a voice that was just barely audible. She paused for a long time, and I could see the anguish in her eyes as she searched for the appropriate words to explain something that made no sense at all. "I have no idea how we got here," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "I have no idea what any of this means," I added honestly. But we can't pretend like nothing happened. She nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving mine. I didn't know either. All I knew was that something had changed between us. Something that none of us could repair. We were both on the brink of something we didn't fully understand. But there was no going back now. The line had been crossed. And whether we wanted to or not, we had to face whatever came next. I know, she whispered. I don't want the admission to linger between us, heavy and loaded with meaning. I'm at a loss for what to do. I murmured in a tremulous voice now. Everything feels so different. With a sigh, she combed through her hair. She acknowledged that it is different, but we must find it out. The day passed in a peculiar sort of haze, and even though her words were intended to be consoling, they did little to calm the storm raging inside of me. There was no roadmap for this, no way to predict what would happen next, and all I knew was that we had entered something far more complicated than either of us had anticipated. Even though we both pretended to undertake chores like cooking and cleaning, the tension between us remained constant. As the hours passed, it became evident that we couldn't avoid it forever. The situation weighed on us like a dark cloud, impossible to ignore. Every glance and small interaction felt loaded with the memory of what had happened the night before, and neither of us knew how to move past it. It was almost like an unspoken agreement that neither of us would discuss what had happened. At least not yet. We were both too afraid to face it and too afraid of what it might mean. We were seated on opposite ends of the couch in the living room later that evening. The stillness between us was so intense, and the air was heavy with unsaid words, that I was at my breaking point. Her eyes were fixed on an invisible point in the distance when she finally spoke, and her voice was soft and almost resigned. I know, she said quietly, but I don't know how to fix this. For her words hit me harder than I expected, the realization that there might not be a way to fix this, that what had happened might have changed everything, was a sober thought. I didn't want to think about what that meant. Didn't want to face the reality that there might not be a way to go back to how things were. I had to say something to break the silence before it suffocated me. I don't know where we go from here, I said abruptly, my voice cutting through the silence. I also don't. She nodded thoughtfully as I confessed that my voice was hardly audible beyond a whisper. She suggested that perhaps we should take some time to determine our shared desires. Time was the only thing we had right now, but I wasn't sure whether it was the answer. Yes, I said in a low voice. Perhaps the silence descended upon us once more, but this time it felt different. There was a sense of closure, a realization that we couldn't proceed until we had had time to think things through. It was a brief respite before we had to confront whatever lay ahead as the night wore on. We sat side by side, but we were worlds apart, and the distance between us had never felt so great. But there was still an unspoken connection, a thread that bound us together even though neither of us knew where it would lead. She replied gently, "I'm going to bed," with a tiredness in her voice that went beyond physical fatigue, although I knew that sleep would be the last thing on my mind. I said, "Yeah, me too." After she left, I sat there for a while with the weight of the day bearing down on me. I had no idea what the future held or how we were going to navigate this strange new reality. But one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. We had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, stepped into territory that was more complicated than either of us could have imagined. And now we were left to deal with the consequences. She lingered for a moment as if she wanted to say something more, but ultimately she just gave me a slight nod and vanished down the hallway, leaving me alone with my thoughts. For the first time in a long time, I felt totally at ease as the house's stillness enveloped me like a thick blanket.